I'm Bill Jasper with the New American Magazine, and it's my pleasure right now to introduce you to Dr. Stephen B. Young. And I've had the pleasure of sharing a panel discussion with him earlier today with the Vietnamese American Association. And I'm so impressed with this scholar, and I'm just going to read a little bit of his background because you may not be familiar with him. I'm particularly interested to dive into his new book, Kissinger's Betrayal: How America Lost the Vietnam War. And as you'll find out, he has personal experience here. I'll just read you a little bit of his bio here on the dust jacket. Stephen B. Young is the Global Executive Director of the Co-Roundtable for Moral Capitalism and the author of Moral Capitalism, Reconciling Private Interests with the Public Good. He's also the author of The Tradition of Human Rights in China and Vietnam and The Theory and Practice of Associative Power. Chords in the Villages of Vietnam, 1967 to 72. He and his wife Pham Thi Tho translated from the Vietnamese the novel about Ho Chi Minh, published as The Zenith. His 1968-71 service in Vietnam for the U.S. Agency for International Development and Village Development and Counterinsurgency was highly praised by President Richard Nixon, Central Intelligence Agency Director William Colby, and Ambassador to Saigon Ellsworth Bunker. In 1975 and again in 1978, Young took a lead in successful efforts to resettle refugees from South Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in the United States. For many years, he was confident of
Nguyen Lap Huy.
He was assistant dean at the Harvard Law School and dean and professor of law at Hamline University School of Law. It's a pleasure to be here with you. We're going to come back again, probably via Zoom or Skype, to do a program just on this book. But today we have a whole different project to deal with. And Dr. Young, you have the distinct situation or honor of being the last person who knows about some very important things that happened in Vietnam. And one of the things we were talking about before our panel discussion earlier today was the assassination of President Diem in Vietnam. And you have some special knowledge about that because of your close friendship with a mutual friend of ours. And so that is one Colonel Nia, who was a very important man at that time in Vietnam. So for our listeners who are not familiar with that Vietnam War era history, if you could basically tell us who President Diem was and what happened and how he was assassinated. Because this, I've never heard of this before.
Well, let me try to set sort of the stage for particularly American viewers. But my real purpose in talking, even though it's in English, is to put on the record while I can, most everybody else has passed on, my admiration for Colonel Nia, who was a friend and a mentor and just a great man. And I want to do this for his family and for him. I think, but that's sort of Vietnamese, even though I'm going to speak in English. It will be, I think, it'll set the record straight on something that's bothered a lot of Vietnamese for many, many years. I think many older Americans may remember their first sort of association with Vietnam were pictures in the newspaper of a Buddhist monk who set himself on fire. He had associates pour gasoline and then light, and he was sacrificing himself as a martyr to call attention to what he thought was bad government. This was in the summer of 1963. And America was really not that involved in the Vietnam War in '63. The government, which was an anti-communist government, was headed by a president, Ngo Dinh Diem, who was a very honorable man and a good man, and actually he was a friend of my father's. My dad had been in the State Department who in 1954 had drafted for President Eisenhower the American Commitment to South Vietnam, a very important document which the anti-war movement ignored, scholars have ignored, journalists have ignored, because if any issues came in 65, 66, 67, 68, why are we in Vietnam? And this letter explains it in one paragraph. The Vietnamese are a people who have their own national traditions, their own honor, their own moral code, which is actually quite similar to ours in terms of individualism and private property and having a government that listens to you and doesn't dictate to you. The South Koreans had their own nationalism, and we helped them. The West Germans had their own nationalism, and we helped them. The South Vietnamese were the same. But President Diem, though he was a nationalist, and my dad admired him for that, and Diem trusted my dad, he listened a lot to his brothers. He had an older brother and some younger brothers, and they actually had different ideas. And they had, I would say, more traditional ideas of top-down governance. And one brother was a Catholic bishop, and then archbishop. Another brother was an intellectual who studied Catholic teachings from the 1930s, personalism, and they put these together to create a secret party structure to rule South Vietnam, which was supposed to be nationalist, but now you had this narrow point of view. So this Buddhist monk, in the summer of '63, is protesting against what he felt was the discrimination against Buddhists by Catholics. And so you had tensions. The communists are exploiting the situation, communists versus nationalists. They're blaming Diem for being a lackey of the American. Now you have divisions between, on the nationalist side, between Buddhists and Catholics. And it's very tense, very difficult. And the military decided that Diem's brother, Nhu in particular, and the other brothers, had no way forward for the country. But Diem listened to his brothers. Even though people admired him as an honest man, as a man who cared for the people, he's trying to do the right thing, he really wasn't in charge of the government. He was the president, but his brother had most influence. So the military decided they had to change the government. And there were three different groups in the military. Now, one thing that very, very important for the whole course of the war, which our American scholars and American journalists really knew nothing about, were the nationalists. Who were the nationalists? Well, there were a whole bunch of nationalists. In particular, there were two political sort of orientations. One was called the Vietnam Quốc Dân Đảng, the Vietnam People's Party, and then the other was the Dai Viet Quốc Dân Đảng, the Great Vietnam Party. And they wanted to have a strong government that could defeat the communists. So they thought Diem, listening to his brothers, was too weak. So they were ready to work, but they were junior officers. They said, we've got to have a strong government in order to fight off the communists. Because ultimately, it's our job as the South Vietnamese. We got to do it by ourselves. There was a second group of also junior officers, but they weren't so political. They were more concerned with the danger of communism. And there was a third group, which is a very small group, but it consisted of generals. And these generals really weren't very political. They had no kind of ideology or passion about nationalism. They weren't part of political parties. They'd been recruited by the French to fight the communists, and they'd been promoted up under the French. But they had the connection to the American embassy. So they used that connection to say to the younger officers, we're in charge. And the younger officers realized that they had to keep the Americans as friends. After the new government had to have support from the American government. So there was kind of like a coalition. And so the coup was pulled, and it was successful quite quickly. November 1, I think it started, 1963. And Diem and his brother Nhu, after one day, kind of recognized that they were not going to be saved by loyal units. So they called into the coup leader, who was there was an office where the coup leaders were working with their staffs. General Min is a big Min, Zhu and Min. And they said, we surrender. We will give up. We will go abroad. And we're in this particular Catholic church. in the Chinese section of Saigon. And so big men then organized a small convoy of several armored personnel carriers and some jeeps to go to that church and pick them up and bring them back to the headquarters. Now, what I understand from Mary's father, her name is Ian, and she's the daughter of Colonel Nghia, Yung Nghia, and from other close associates of his, part of the Dai Viet party, sort of what happened. Nghia had come, he was part of the Armor Corps, and he had been tasked, he had a major role in the coup with the armored units. He had been tasked to lead this convoy to go pick up the president and his younger brother. And so he walks into the room where all the staff people are on the radio and making plans and deciding what to do, with another Vietnamese officer, a Captain Nhung. At the back side of the big room, apparently, was a small meeting room. And in there were three of the generals. There was this general, Yung Van Min. There was this other general, Mai Hu Suan, and the third general, Lê Van Kim. And they had been talking privately among themselves in that room. What we understand later is that General Mai Hu Suan made an argument to the leader, Big Min, that President Diem had to be killed too. Don't send him abroad. Don't let him retire in the mountains of Dalat or someplace. If he stays alive, the Catholics and the Kung Lao Party, which is sort of a quasi-Catholic party of New, they will try their best to organize another coup, to foment street demonstrations, to make the situation untenable, which would only help the communists, and implicitly, big men, they want to get rid of you. So if you want to be the leader of Vietnam, you have to solve this problem. And what happened next, according to Colonel Nghia, is that the three generals come out of the room, and General Big Men takes his two fingers like this and puts them over his belt buckle. And that is apparently the signal for two. Not one person, two people. Nghia, who's done a major, he sees that, but he doesn't know what it means at this point. So they get in the convoy, they go down to the church, they pick up President Diem, his brother New, who are put in the back of an APC, and they drive back to headquarters. One of the three generals, Mai Hu Suan, also goes along with the convoy. He's sort of going along. He's not in charge of the convoy, but he's there, but he's going along. So as the convoy is coming back to the headquarters, it has to stop where a railroad line crosses a main highway, and there's a train, so they have to stop to let the train go by. At that point, this other Captain Nhung, who is the aide to the big general, General Min, takes out a gun and shoots the two brothers, President New and President Diem.
In the APC?
In the APC. The driver of the APC then gets on the radio to Colonel Nghia, who's in his jeep, says, or to Major Nghia, and says Major, Kong Ngoi Ha, Hai Ngoi, Hai V. Somebody has just cut down the two senior people. And Nghia is shocked, and he says to the toy guy, "Good, just can't do anything about it, just keep going." So they get back to the headquarters, and the general who's with them, Mai Hu Suan, goes first to meet, and then the other generals, Big Men, leaving others, are coming out. And first of all, nobody expects Diem to have been shot. When they hear and they see, they're all shocked. All these generals are just shocked. Because people admired Diem. He was called Gu, which is sort of respected elder. Mai Hu Suan then walks forward in front of General Big Men and says, mission accompli in French, mission accomplished. So you have the orders of two fingers, and then the general comes back and says, the job is done. And so I have felt, and from my friends, that the real impetus, the motivation to kill Diem was from Mai Hu Suan. And General Big Min, however, he has to accept the responsibility because he gave the orders. He could have overruled Mai Hu Suan, but he didn't. And so Diem, who was a good man, who cared about his country, never married, was completely dedicated and faithful, but he had this I mean, we all have our tragedies, Bill, in our lives. Somebody said something about in the Garden of Eden, you know, we came out of the Garden of Eden and we ate perfect. Ziem had this insecurity about his brothers. He could not stand up to them. He relied on, he trusted them, he listened to them, and he subordinated himself. And that was a tragedy for him and for Vietnam, and by the way, for the United States. Because to conclude this story, once the Diem government was overthrown, Vietnam entered a period of political chaos in 64, 65, particularly 64 and 65, lasting until 66 and then 67, as trying to find a good nationalist government. The struggle was to get a good nationalist government. And there were some generals who really wanted to run the show, Nguyen Can, Nguyen Cao Ki. They were not good nationalists. And as there was chaos, political chaos and factionalism in South Vietnam, the communists in Hanoi got all excited because they said the nationalists are falling apart. Attack. And so they started sending down North Vietnamese soldiers into South Vietnam to escalate the war. When this happened, the Americans felt they had to respond because our government knew. And since then, we now have the documents that Hanoi was behind the war. So we felt we had to keep Eisenhower's word to help the nationalists. But that meant American soldiers were sent to Vietnam, and we were on the slippery slope of the Vietnam War. And it goes back to this event of also murdering Diem and unleashing factionalism and fear. And Colonel Nghia was a witness, and he could tell us indirectly now, since he's passed away, what happened.
So that is a totally new story, as far as I know. If you go looking for information about the Diem assassination now, as far as I know, you never get a identification of the trigger man who actually carried out the assassination. And as you point out, it was the aide-de-camp to General Minh.
Yes.
And
but to interrupt, a trigger man is just follows orders. The historically significant thing, the point for moral responsibility, who gave the order? And that's, I think, as I said, General Minh has to accept the responsibility because he gave the order, he put up two fingers. But this other guy, Mai Hu Sun, who, by the way, had, as we might say, a checkered past. He was the one who made the argument. He created the reasons for Minh to decide to kill Diem. Mai Hu Sun came out of the police. I knew very superficially his younger brother, who was a village chief in the province of Vinh Long, where I was a young guy advising the Pacification Village Development Program. As I vaguely remember, as a young man, Mai Hu Sun volunteered to serve the French in the 1930s. Then when the Japanese came in World War II and pushed the French aside, he went over to serve the Japanese. And at the end of World War II, when the Japanese lost, he went back to serving the French. Then in 1954-55, when the French were leaving Vietnam, he switched over to Ngo Dinh Diem, to follow Diem. Then in 1963, when Diem is in trouble, he turns against Diem. I mean, this is a guy who's always turning against people.
totally self-serving.
Totally self-serving. And you know, that's the kind of man he was.
No evidence that he was actually working for Ho Chi Minh.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think
this
this
is
is
more
just
pragmatic.
this is pragmatic.
Talleyrand type of guy.
This is the pragmatic struggle for power among people who have no more vision in life than their own power, their own money, their own prerogative.
Now, what about if you look into the literature and the stories for the last 50 years? One of the other theories about it is that the CIA was involved with it. Now, in this scenario that Colonel Nghia related to you, he was an eyewitness, he was there. Is there any indication that those who argued for or gave the order were working with the CIA on this?
There is evidence, and I think it's true, I've always accepted it, that there was a contact person between the small group of generals that I talked about and the CIA. That man's name was Lucien Conin. My particular sense, both from the American side and from the Vietnamese side, is that Conin's role was really that of being a telephone between the two sides. The Vietnamese generals would tell him things. He would then go tell the American CIA and the embassy, and mostly the CIA didn't tell him anything. They just used him to follow. And the generals then used their contact with Conin to the CIA, with the younger officers saying, we have the channel to the Americans, and you don't. Therefore, you need us as the leaders. And the younger officers, including Nia, kind of went along with that, because they didn't have any contacts with the CIA. In fact, one of the great intellectual failures of the Americans, in my judgment, over decades, is we never got to know the Dai Viets. We never got to know, and then the Tung Dai Viet party that grew out of that, we never got to know them.
Well, explain that, the nationalist Dai Viet party, because that again goes back to Colonel Nia.
Right. Now, Nia, so there was a group of young men, some women, in the late 1930s, who put together a political theory which was Vietnamese and modern, but it wasn't communist and it wasn't French. It was bringing
But at that time we're running.
Right. The communists were being pushed by the Russians, right? And the French were ruling, and a lot of Vietnamese studied in France. They learned French. They were thinking of Western theories.
Which is where a lot of the Vietnamese communists were trained.
And then communism came to Vietnam from the West, from France. So there's this one intellectual, young man by the name of Truong Tu An, who wrote up a statement about the Vietnamese people as a great historic people. Now, Vietnamese believe, and there's archaeological evidence to support this, that their origin is as old as the Chinese. They're not inferior to the Chinese in any way except maybe in numbers. Chinese talk about 3,000 years of civilization. Vietnamese talk about 4,000 years of civilization. The Vietnamese had a Bronze Age culture at the same time the Chinese had a Bronze Age culture. And they fought against the Chinese and they kicked them out 4 or 5 times. So in this theory of our people being a noble people, this group of young people came up with a theory which said no French and no communists. We want to be Vietnamese. Now, my friend Colonel Nia joined this party at age 17 in the late 1930s. But the Dai Viet party was hated by the communists and was hated by the French. So if you joined the Dai Viet party in the late 30s or 40s or 50s, you were taking a chance, because they would either kill you or they'd make trouble for you or something like this. And in fact, the man who started the party, Truong Tu An, was murdered by Ho Chi Minh's people in 1946, along with the guy who started the Wahao religion, along with Cao Dai religious people, along with other nationalists. Right? So my friend Colonel Nia comes out of that, and so when you get to 63, and the communists have taken over North Vietnam, and they're trying to expand down to the south, and you're a loyal Vietnamese, and you've got 4,000 years of honor behind you, you're trying to put together something which is worthy of the Vietnamese people. And you're not going to sell out to the CIA. But our CIA people, our embassy, there's a 2-volume book of theory called Young Top Shinton, which was written by another friend of mine, the Professor Hui, H-U-Y, whom Colonel Nia introduced me to, which is one reason why I'm grateful to Colonel Nia. It's a brilliant book, 2 volumes of political theory, which ends up in exact parallel to the American Declaration of Independence and Constitution. 2 volumes in Vietnamese. How many Americans do you think have ever read it?
Probably 1.
What can I say? How many people have you sent out there with the CIA, State Department, Defense Intelligence Agency, the military? We're talking thousands of Americans.
Many of which could read.
Could read and write Vietnamese. They didn't even know it. Now, one of the problems with this book, Young Top Shinto, the first copies I have, is it was privately published in 1964. When it was written, you couldn't publish it. The French wouldn't let you publish it. So it had to be privately published and taken hand to hand from person to person. So there's a sort of a practical reason. But my sense is, when I'm out there, in the mid-60s, 70s, we wrote this book in 64. You just ask somebody, how did I get a copy? He gave me a copy.
Colonel Mia.
No, Professor Wee.
Oh.
So I got to know. Any embassy officer could have called up Professor Wee. He's a teacher at the National Institute of Administration, and say, excuse me, Professor Wee, I understand you, it was under a different name, Hung Nguyen. I understand you've written this book. By any chance, could you give me a copy? And I'm sure Professor Wee would have been delighted. Oh, in fact, I'll give you 2 copies, and you can give one to the ambassador. Right? Nobody asked. So anyway, to get back to coup and the CIA, Konin. So Konin did that. Now, a lot of Vietnamese, a lot of Americans.
This is Lucien Konin.
Lucien Konin in '63, before the coup, the run up to the coup. A lot of Vietnamese, a lot of Americans, and others have used the Konin connection to say, aha, we know the CIA has participated in black ops in other countries. Therefore, they must have been behind the murder. We also, however, have evidence that the morning of the coup, our ambassador, Henry Cabot Lodge, personally called the generals. I think either he personally called the generals or it went through Konin. I can't remember. But he went out of his way to say, safe passage for Diem out of Vietnam. That's what the Americans want. So the decision by Big Min and Mai Hu-Sun was contrary to what the Americans wanted. The third piece of evidence we have is that back in Washington, when President Kennedy was told that Diem II was killed, he was shocked. He was absolutely shocked. He knew this was a horrible, terrible thing, and it surprised him.
So, again, to go back to Colonel Mia, he became, or was he already at that time, a very high level of the
Dai Viet Party, yes. As a young man, I don't quite know. When I was there, I was just learning this stuff, so I didn't know I should have. And then, I went home and he stayed and all that kind of. I never really got a chance to do just a biography of him, saying what happened, what, and I've never because again I'm a friend of a lot. People are my friends. It's not my place to ask too much about how they're organized and things like that. But Nghia was certainly, he had a very senior position in the party, but I would say, from my experience, there's another dimension which was special to Nghia, and there's a story that goes with this. He had a personal character of dignity and courage and smarts that people respected. So he had an influence far above his rank. Even as a young captain in the 40s and the 50s, he was with a training center, he was doing all kinds of things. He had an energy, it's kind of a charisma, we would say, that people respected. So there's this one story, which everybody would remember, most older Americans, even younger people who read about it, most Vietnamese, the communist offensive in 1968, the Tet Offensive, which took place during a truce, like a Christmas truce. Nobody's supposed to be no fighting. So most of the South Vietnamese army and police, they were at home for the holidays, right? Then the communists attack. So they attack on the night when the holiday starts at midnight. So I think 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning, the Viet Cong units all over the country, but in Saigon, they rush into the cities, they start shooting, blowing things up, capturing police stations, they're capturing individuals to take them out to kill them. And Nhia's at home with his family, but he's got the radio for the armored units. He's an armor officer, and all the armored units had their own radio frequency where they could talk to each other. So he's at home, as I gather it. I once talked to him about this, and I said, "Do you do this?" He said, "Don't believe it." He's listening to the radio. The shooting started. He turns on the radio, and he hears a couple of things. He immediately gets the point that a communist unit has gone to the armor base, I think in Go About, where they have tanks and APCs, in order to immobilize it. And they're killing some families, but they're also going on the radio network of the armor to give confusing orders. So you've got the different men, officers, sergeants, things like that, with a tank here, APC over there, this and that. They're not, they know something's happening bad. They don't know where to go. Who's in command? What's going on? What should we do? Because they're getting these mixed messages, and they don't even know who the voice is. Is this generally one of our commanders? Is this somebody else? What's happening? So Mia figures that out. Also, the communists are attacking the South Vietnamese and U.S. military headquarters at the airfield on the outskirts of Saigon. If they take the airfield and the military headquarters, both the United States and the South Vietnamese are in a heap of trouble. So you've got to protect the headquarters and the airfield. So at the same time, nationalist Vietnamese commanders are giving orders to armored units to go to the airport and help defend the airport and the headquarters. But the drivers and the officers, they don't know what to do. So Mia gets on the radio and he just broadcasts. And he says, "Anh Tie Cap," which means men of the armored command. And then he says, "This is Nghia. De la Nghia." He doesn't say Major Nghia. He can't say General Nghia because he's not a general. He has no formal position in '68 with the armored. He's just at home on leave. But he says, "This is Nghia. Listen to me. Do not listen to anybody else." Something like that. Let me tell you what's going on. There's an immediate crisis at the Tan Son Nhut Airport with the headquarters. Units have to go there now and defend it. And then apparently he starts giving orders. Troop number 3, you will go here. Troop number 4, you will go there. Number 2, this. And don't listen to anybody else. And you got to be there by 2 a.m. or this kind of stuff. This is just some guy who's a junior officer in his home broadcasting over the armored network. And what happens? Everybody obeys him. Why? Because they trust him. Now that's an unusual person.
That personal command that they knew they could trust.
Yes, yes. And I would say, Bill, that my feeling is, as an American, that there's some psychic, emotional, cultural integration of Colonel Nhia's nationalism, being a Dai Viet, and having other people trust him. Because they know the guy is not there scheming for himself. He's not trying to do this so he could become the Minister of Defense or become defense attaché in Washington, D.C., or have his brother-in-law get a contract from the U.S. No, they know the guy's doing it because he cares about the country.
That's a very important story that hasn't been told, and I'm so grateful that you have brought that out. All of this...
I'm sorry, maybe I should tell you, because people may say, why does Steve Young know Colonel Nghia? How did he get to know the Dai Viets? And I have to say it was all by chance. And a lot of things happen by chance. And the question is...
Providence.
Or Providence. Or Providence. And the question is, if it comes your way, what do you do with it? So I was assigned, totally by accident, to be an advisor at the district level in a province in the Mekong Delta, Vinh Long. And Colonel Nghia was the province chief. And I got to know him, more stories there, we don't really have time for that, but I said, this guy's remarkable. I'd see him with villagers, I'd see him with this and that. He had instincts with people, he had strategic, he could integrate the civilian, political, economic, social, and cultural. I could see him with the Wahao troops, I could see him over here. He knew how to respect the Catholics. He's a remarkable guy. So anyway, he and I kind of got along. And I took him as a mentor, and he kind of took a shine to me. And then he later introduced me to Professor Wee, and then, sort of one thing led to another.
Wow. Well, that is a very stimulating story and information. But you also want to speak to your Vietnamese friends here. So
well, there's if any Vietnamese watch this, there was a number of years ago, I was reading a book about a great Vietnamese hero, Nhi Tung Kien, who was a Vietnamese general who in 1030, 1060, I can't remember the year, he defeated a Sung Dynasty army which had invaded Vietnam. And I was reading a book by a historian. Again, actually, this historian in the 1930s was part of the intellectual movement that helped stimulate the Dai Viets. Because what they were doing, Wang Sun Han was his name, and there were some others, another guy, Phan Boi Chau. they were like, in the 1930s, under the French, taking a new look at the history of their people. And they're seeing different things. They're not seeing the emperor in Wei, they're not seeing this, they're not seeing that, they're seeing strong leaders sort of coming up. So he writes this book on Li Tongkiet, and I'm reading it, and he discovered, because nobody else had paid attention, in central Vietnam, there's a pagoda where I think Li Tongkiet was buried. And there's what the Vietnamese call a bia. It's like a memorial gravestone kind of thing. And I read it, and as soon as I read it, I thought of Khmer. I said, this is like Nia. So in Vietnamese, and my Vietnamese isn't that good anymore, but làm việc thì siêng năng, điều kiện dân thì đáng hảo, cho nên dân được nhờ cậy. The people trusted him, right? Quan Hoa giúp đỡ trăm họ. Very cleverly, he helped the 100 clans. He's helping everybody, right? Nhân từ yêu mến mọi người. He loved everybody. Cho nên, nhân dân kính trọng. Therefore, the people respected him. Dùng uy vũ để trừ gian ác. He used his power to get rid of bandits and bad people. Đem minh chúng để giải quyết ngục thùng, bringing true evidence, factual evidence, to solve problems of prisoners and things like that. Cho nên, hình ngục không quá lắm. Therefore, punishments were not too severe. Right? We should think about that in America today. Thái quý biết rằng dân lấy sự nọ ấm làm đạo. People were, because of this, people were able to take nọ ấm, happiness and warmth as their head. Nước lấy nghe nấm làm gốc. The country took agriculture as its basis. Cho nên không để nở thời vụ. You could get through times. Tài giỏi mà không khỏe khoắn. Talented but not boastful. Nuôi dưỡng đến con những người già ở nơi thôn đá. He would take care of old people in rural areas, sort of poor areas. Cho nên, người già nhờ thế mà được yên thân. The older people relied on his power to be have a quiet heart, to be satisfied. Phép thác như vậy có thể là cai gấp trị nước. This kind of action is the way you should rule a country. Cai thuốc yên dân sự tốt đẹp đều ở đây cả. The method of pacifying the people is the beautiful and the good in everything. And when I read this, I thought of, hey, that sounds like Khmer.
Well, that's a great tribute to him and to our friend Mary's father. It's been a pleasure, and we're going to get you back. Probably do a Zoom call if we don't get back together in person on a couple of different topics. One being your book, which just came out this year,
Yes,
a couple of months
ago.
Kissinger's Betrayal: How America Lost the Vietnam War. We were looking at it earlier today, and you pointed out some of the documents, which I had never had a clue.
Nobody knows about it. Nobody knows about it.
Very important, very important. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm going to read it first, and then we'll dive into it.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.